I am not excited about the Westeros cinematic universe. Like, ever since Game of Thrones ended, George R. R. Martin and HBO have been pitching ideas for countless spin off shows. And it's not as over the top as what Disney has been doing with Star Wars shows, but still, there's been so much announced and either cancelled or just in limbo forever. And here's the thing, in the hands of a competent showrunner, could the Jon Snow sequel show have worked? Not impossible, but even if it was good, it would be fan fiction. Same like with the shows they're pitching about Nymeria or Yi, like these are things George has written maybe a few paragraphs about, so it would essentially be an original story by someone else latched onto a successful IP to make money. So that's why I was excited for Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, because while House of the Dragon is technically an adaptation, Fire and Blood is written like a historical text, so the dialogue and the scene-by-scene narrative still have to be developed by the writers of the show, and they have to fill in a lot of gaps. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is the first time we are getting George's conventionally written stories adapted since like 2015. And even the early seasons of Game of Thrones, while undeniably great TV, it wasn't a great adaptation. It was solid and probably as good as we could have hoped for, given that the show had to worry about things like sets and CGI budgets and rapidly aging child actors, issues that a book will never have. But here with a smaller story, both in scale and in length, maybe we could finally have that perfect adaptation. Now, I'll be the first person to admit that I am an elitist when it comes to A Song of Ice and Fire, especially when it comes to the adaptations. Like, I think every show should cater to people like me specifically, and if casual audiences who haven't read the books don't like it or think it's boring, then there's other shows you can watch. And from the sounds of it, showrunner Ira Parker actually cared about making a faithful adaptation too. George seemed happy, although George has been vocally pleased with the first season of each of these shows, and then either stopped talking to the writers or openly feuded with them. But there were things I was worried about, mainly the structure. The Hedge Knight is a fairly short story, and 6 episodes just seemed like stretching it really thin. Even when it was announced that the episodes would be shorter than the typical Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon episodes, there was still the question of what would be the big moments in the story to end individual episodes on. In addition to that, a lot of the story is told through Dunk's internal monologue, and since he's alone throughout much of the story, just turning that into dialogue with another character wasn't necessarily a solution. Then there's also the fact that any additions to the story might seem unnecessary because The Hedge Knight is such a great story. Like, I simp for A Storm of Swords as much as the next person, but The Hedge Knight is literally perfect. I would not change a word of it. So any new scenes or artistic changes would need to be really good in order to justify their existence. Finally, there's the possibility that this show would do what House of the Dragon did and try to tie into the main series. Would a bunch of characters be motivated because they know about the White Walker invasion in 100 years? Would Bloodraven show up wielding the Valyrian dagger that has one ring to rule them all written on it? Who knows? But I went into the show optimistic, if only for the fact that the fandom has very little to look forward to these days. And for the most part, the show has been great. The casting is fantastic, but that's what I've come to expect from this franchise. Both Peter Claffey and Dexter Sol Ansel fit their roles, and more importantly, their dynamic together works very well. Like, that was what would make or break the show. And I love how there is that subtle difference in the way they talk. Egg in particular speaks really properly, but almost tries to downplay that, especially in the first half of the season when he's trying to blend in with the commoners. And there's also an interesting thing as they're both kind of fish out of water characters. Like, Aegon is obviously used to high society, but he's not used to living in the dirt with people. Meanwhile, Dunk is used to being on the road, but he's not used to interacting with so many people that are high above his status. So yeah, they both do a really great job, especially when they're working together. The supporting cast has been fun to watch too. Baelor, Maekar, Tansel, Steely Pate, the Fossaways, they all come off the page superbly. Sir Arlen has been interesting as well, since we never actually see him in the novella apart from his funeral at the beginning, but now we get to see this obvious madman who is still a better knight than most in Westeros. Not that that's a very high bar. One performance that really has grown on me is Finn Bennett as Aerion. In the novella, he's a lot more theatrical, almost similar to Aemon from House of the Dragon. He's not quite a cartoony villain, but in a franchise that's famous for morally gray characters, he's one of those irredeemable antagonists. But in the show, he's a lot more reserved. He doesn't seem to get joy from his cruelty. It's just so matter-of-fact, like, this is the way the world works, this is the hierarchy of things. And I think that's really interesting because it's something we haven't really seen before. Although I do wonder whether future seasons might have him become gradually more over-the-top crazy, since this Aerion doesn't seem like the type of person who would drink wildfire thinking it would make him a dragon. The absolute standout has been Lionel Baratheon, who is barely in the story, mostly a colorful background character who agrees to join Dunk's side near the end. I just love what they've done with the character, and Daniel Inks does a great job. While the new material with Lionel is fantastic, I do have a few nitpicks. One is that scene later where Dunk, Egg, and the Fossways are trying to figure out who they might ask to fight on their side. Like, that's a scene taken directly from the book, but I don't know why Show Dunk wouldn't immediately think to ask Lionel. He might refuse, but Lionel had shown such interest in him earlier, it had to be at least worth considering. Also, while this bromance between Lionel and Dunk has been a joy to watch, I worry that in a potential third season, when John the Fiddler has a similar camaraderie with Dunk, it might almost seem repetitive. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. What is clear is that Ira Parker is planting seeds for future seasons, because years from now, Aegon arranges a marriage between his first son and Lionel's daughter, but his son ends up marrying some random girl he meets, and Lionel rebels against the throne, and then Dunk has to 1v1 him. Like, the idea of the show, or the books for that matter, reaching this point of Lord Commander Duncan fighting Lionel the Laughing Storm is so far-fetched, but I'm glad Parker is at least thinking about these things. I do think that Lionel's open disdain for Baelor in the last episode was a bit jarring. Like, the anti-Targaryen sentiments are really strong in the show, and I'll touch on that in a bit later, but I feel like Lionel is way too important of a person to be making those sorts of statements out in the open, especially to someone he doesn't really know that well. His statement about an upcoming war is obviously a reference to the idea that Bittersteel will probably try to conquer Westeros again, which even in-universe is not a shocking prediction. I feel like the way it's worded, though, it's maybe trying to convince casual audiences that Lionel might team up with the Blackfires. I mean, to my knowledge, House Baratheon never sides with them, but maybe they'll try to add some tension by making the Baratheons waver a bit. I don't know, that scene was a bit iffy, but other than that, Lionel was fantastic. Oh, and Lionel's helm, I just loved it. Yeah, and Aerion's too, and Stefan Fossway. They actually made Apple-themed armor look cool. Both this show and House of the Dragon have done such a great job with costumes and sets. It's such a welcome change from that whole everyone wear black because it's depressing vibe we saw in the later Game of Thrones seasons. Same with, like, Ashford Meadow feels like a lived-in place, even though it's literally just a field. I know a huge appeal of this show for the HBO execs was the smaller budget, but they've still done so much with what they had to work with. And Flea Bottom too, this is perhaps the best version of that we've seen across all three shows. It's not just the poor district, it's so claustrophobic and oppressive. Yeah, wouldn't you rob corpses to get out of that place if you lived there? Let me know down below. Or maybe don't do that. I also really like the music. I especially noticed in the first episode, it has that medieval adventure-y vibe to it, nothing grand and operatic. It really reminded me of the soundtrack for The Witcher, no, That Witcher, or some of the ambient music from The Last of Us, no, That Last of Us. And I feel like there's some deeper meaning about the beginning of the show where the Game of Thrones theme started to play and then it abruptly cut to Dunk after Taco Bell. There's a metaphor there somewhere. I know a lot of people have had gripes with the more bodily humor in this show. I haven't hated it, although the fart during Dunk's plea to the people in episode 4 was just a baffling decision. Might as well talk about the changes to the show now. Not a lot was removed from the book, but I do have some thoughts about what was added in. When the show was first announced, I wondered whether, due to the short length of the novellas, this might be a bigger show about this time period in general, which I would have been okay with, as this is one of my favorite eras of Westeros history, and while that didn't happen, there is definitely some background world building that wasn't present in the original story, mainly because I think George hadn't invented the Blackfires yet. An important topic in Westeros history is how once the Targaryens lost all of their dragons, they were basically just one or two shitty kings away from being overthrown, and you do sort of see this resentment to the monarchy in the show. Like, obviously you have Raymond Fossway go off on a tangent about how awful the Targaryens are, but there's also stuff how, like, Aerion killing a horse basically almost starts a riot, and while, like many people, I am disappointed that the show left out the scene where regular people wish Dunk good luck in his trial, and Steely Pate says he's a knight who remembered his vows, it does almost make up for it in the actual trial when you think that Dunk died and the crowd ends up cheering him on as he's getting up to fight Aerion again, so, you know, you gain some, you lose some. I did also like the scene where Egg is practicing with a sword and he meets Robin Risling, who is by far the least developed of the 7 in the book. However, that's almost undone by the 2 Humphreys having even less screen time. Like, I don't think Humphrey Beesbury is mentioned a single time by name until episode 5. And apparently the fight between the 2 Humphreys is showcased in that first joust in episode 2, but like, are you going to know that unless you specifically know to look for it? Again, I don't want every episode of Dunk and Egg to be an hour because the pacing would really drag, but when we have so much extra time, like what would it hurt to give the supporting cast like even a minute of extra screen time? One of the biggest additions to the show was the subplot about Lord Ashford's steward trying to convince Dunk to choose Ashford's son as his opponent so he can win lots of money. Now, on paper, I don't dislike this addition, and I do think that the observation of how much is being spent on the tourney while common people are struggling is intentional. And it goes back to the idea that in this period, Targaryen rule is very fragile. And when you compound that with the Great Spring Sickness and the drought and the lingering resentment from the Blackfire rebellions, I do think this will be a major theme in the show as a whole. But the problem is that the show completely ignored Dunk's plan to challenge Valar. Now, ultimately, who Dunk was planning on challenging doesn't matter, since he ends up not participating in the tourney at all, but Valar's small role here is the problem. Dunk notices that Valar's opponents are either really old or really inexperienced, and that he himself isn't that great of a fighter, and Dunk thinks he might have a solid chance to beat him, but he wonders if he'll even be allowed to challenge a prince. The thing that makes Valar's success in the tourney important is that it adds another layer to Maekar. The show does a solid job showing how Maekar is constantly overshadowed by Baelor, but in the books there's that extra salt in the wound of Maekar's sons being overshadowed by Baelor's sons, and I feel like that was missing. I also have mixed feelings on the witch that tells Dunk and Egg their fortunes. Now, part of this really comes down to the fact of, is Egg being a future king a spoiler? And both in the show and the books, it is technically possible to not get spoiled if you let certain lines just go over your head, and the story is still certainly enjoyable even if you know that Egg becomes king and Dunk becomes Lord Commander, and then everything goes to shit at Summerhall. This scene just kind of reminded me of that scene in House of the Dragon where we find out that Helena's a green seer and she just flat out tells Aemon how he's going to die. Then again, since we know that Egg becomes obsessed with prophecy towards the end of his life, it is possible that they wanted him to become consumed by this prediction that everyone he knows will be happy he died. Again, don't hate this scene, and I will try to keep an open mind. Another big change is the flashback to Dunk's childhood. In a vacuum, I did really like this sequence. I think its placement in the show was a little jarring in terms of pacing, but I don't actually know if there would have been a better spot for it. Like I said earlier, the depiction of Flea Bottom was really well done. One minor issue is that the whole thing builds towards Arlen telling Dunk to get up, and he could have literally just done that when he first saved Dunk in that alley, instead of needing Dunk to try and track him down afterwards. Although we did get Arlen singing in, I think, Dothraki, so it was worth it. Finally, before the show aired, I thought that they might try to have a flashback of Dunk and Flea Bottom, not specifically him meeting Arlen, but in a later novella, I think Dunk mentions that he once saw Bloodraven in King's Landing, and I was worried that we would have a scene of Dunk in a crowd spotting Bloodraven and his men passing through, and then Bloodraven would just suddenly turn in Dunk's direction, and I'm glad we didn't get something like that. On a side note, I did think that Dunk having stolen items that still had Blackfire insignias on them was going to be relevant, maybe he gets caught with that and the Gold Cloaks think he's a spy, but nothing came out of that. I think the show is just sprinkling in these references to teach casual audiences about the Blackfires without it getting too expository. One thing I was really hoping the show wouldn't do is give a definitive answer to the "is Dunk really a knight" theory. I say definitive, even if the show did say, you could just argue that there's a difference between show canon and book canon. As obvious as it is, R plus L equals J is technically still a theory until confirmed by the source material. But nevertheless, I'm glad the show has shied away from flat out saying this, even though it is even more obvious in the show. For those unaware, there is some evidence to suggest that Dunk was never actually knighted, most notably the fact that he always gets noticeably uncomfortable when he's asked about that situation, and he also hesitates when Raymond asks to be knighted. The point is that despite not being officially a knight, Dunk still displays the right qualities more than most real knights. The show adds on to this by having Sir Arlen basically just shrug off the idea of knighting Dunk, and Sir Arlen's portrayal has been eccentric enough that his response doesn't necessarily mean no, but there's just enough to make certain implications. In the finale, Dunk straight up asks him, and I guess Arlen still could have knighted him after the Penny Tree story, but it feels like they really wanted to make sure that even the people who are on their phones during the show understood this. I'm sure if the show keeps going, we will get an actual answer to this, especially since I feel like once Dunk is asked to join the Kingsguard, he probably would have been ashamed of carrying on this charade, and he would just admit the truth. Although, could you imagine if that theory of Dunk having to kill Egg at Summerhall to defend his family were true, and Egg's like, "You can't kill me, sir. That's not what a true knight would do." And then Dunk's like, "I am no true knight." Jesus, imagine if that happened. The actual trial scene was incredible. Now, I have a pet peeve when it comes to injuries in movies and shows. Like, even if he had access to modern medicine, Dunk was not walking away from that fight alive. But I do appreciate that they really hammered in just what an absolute shit experience this kind of fight would be. And while it would have been cool to see everyone else fighting, like Lionel and the Fossaways facing off and Baylor juggling Maikar and the Kingsguard, I think it was the right decision to focus just on Dunk and Arion, and I especially love the POV shots from inside the helm. A couple of miscellaneous points from the finale. I love that they mentioned that Baylor was wearing Valar's armor. That bit had been missing from the previous episode, and I actually think they made it even better here. The little gag about there being 9 kingdoms was also funny and really tied in how Egg is way more book smart than Dunk, who is more street smart. I also love that we got an ending for Raymond Fossaway. He has become a fan favorite, and I suppose they could try and maybe bring him back in the Mystery Knight, but it would be a bit of a stretch. So if this is it, I'm glad that he got a solid send-off, and him getting Sweetfoot was a really cool addition since we never actually get closure on whether Dunk ended up buying her back, so that was a lovely moment. Alright, might as well talk about the ending. I had been enjoying what they were doing with Maikar. People often call him Stannis Targaryen, and man, did that shine through in this episode. I think his scenes with Dunk in this episode were maybe actually better than the book, but I really didn't care for the last scene. When Dunk and Egg rode off, and I saw that we were only like 25 minutes into the episode, I immediately thought we were getting some like mid-credits scene where they hype up Bloodraven like something out of the MCU. Like you'd have a list of the Targaryen line of succession, you just cross Baelor's name off. Like I love Bloodraven, but he does not need to be behind everything. Anyways, the last scene, not crazy about it. Like Ira Parker has said that this will be addressed, but I mean, what is the point? Yes, technically we never got confirmation that Maikar let Egg go until the second novella, but that's it. We do know. So in the show, I guess either he figures Egg is with Dunk and just hopes for the best, or they catch the two of them like a mile away from Ashford Meadow and Maikar just forgives him. I don't know, I just don't see why that decision was made. So, all in all, was A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms the first great A Song of Ice and Fire adaptation? Yeah, I think it was. Last scene aside, I think they absolutely did a great job. Sure, a scene here or a line there is absent, but for the most part, they got the story and the characters right. Even the first season of Game of Thrones, while incredible, had certain characters whose personalities and motivations were completely opposite of their book counterparts. But this was basically the Hedge Knight come to life, and most of the changes served to add to the story, not take away. So I have high hopes going forward. As much as I love the Sworn Sword, I imagine it's really challenging to adapt it as it's not particularly thrilling TV, but I think this crew might be able to pull it off. Just when I thought I was done with this franchise, they pull me back in.